me, but I just showed up. That's literally what they do to Africa. That's those people's land, those are those people's resources, and we don't have a right to go in there and do jack crap with it. And if you have dark skin and you feel that this is cool, please find whatever Michael Jackson did and follow that line, because you are whitey white, super white, super whitey whitey, charcoal white. I want my
Think about that. They've been killing each other with machetes and machine guns for almost 40 years.
Not just
But now, but it's not our business. Well, I guess it ain't our business what they're doing with the U.S. government then.
Let me ask you this. Since you're so high and mighty, if you participated in the rape and pillage of the Iraq War for 15 years, and the between 400,000 and 1.1 million people that died if you participated in that war.
I was actually very curious
Because this is stopping.
to say.
Your velocity for participated in the Iraq.
Okay, let me give you my veracity about that. First of all, if you've enlisted in the actual military, you understand that you signed a contract saying that you are giving your body to the U.S. government for them to do with it as they will. I did not I signed a contract, so wherever they sent me, I had to do what I was ordered to do. I know most people don't understand what contracts are, and they don't understand what orders are, but that's what orders are. Okay, when I signed that contract, I did not know I was going to war, and I would have made a different decision. But since I was under contract, I signed a contract to follow orders, and that's exactly what I did. And I didn't.
Because I think there are contradictory analyses. But never has that been more apparent than at the Supreme Court level. We saw all these votes today on the 6-3, all of them, I think, decision based on, if not attributed to the person who appointed them, certainly based on ideology. We know who ideologically are the conservative judges, and we know ideologically, oh boy, I'm going to go back to sleep and start all over again. Got up on the wrong side of the bed. I can't pronounce words today. Who the judges are. So, what difference does it make whether that political affiliation, perception, or reality is manifested at the lower court level versus at the Supreme Court?
Well, everyone's second very. I'm not sure. But I think the issue that I'm really trying to highlight is it almost. I think there's just so much room for obstructionism. You have multiple. If you can just go to a lower court and challenge something, you can judge choppy. So even take the politics out. If you just have a sense, because there's hundreds of these judges, and you know based on their rulings of other things, probably this is a good judge for this topic. Who's gonna be able to stretch and say whatever it is.
Generally speaking, there'd be some judge shopping going on, but as I understand it, it's based on rotation and on the federal court bench that who's up for the case. So you might question which district ought to have jurisdiction over a case based on the history of decisions made in that district and in that larger circuit. I think that occurs, but I'm not so sure actual judge shopping cases has the Supreme Court ruled it's ultimately going to go to the Supreme Court. Why even have lower courts if every case is going to go to the Supreme Court? I guess I don't understand the argument, and you maybe have to clarify it in my mind if you don't mind.
Well, because it's obstructionist. If it's that,
Well, wait a minute.
then it's an injunction, then now the Supreme Court is taking that burden onto itself. But it's also giving more guarantee that you can't have you can't just get tied up in the process, in the bureaucracy and the red tape. We're not, we only live so long, and we don't have years and years to get things done. Sometimes we have to get things done quickly. I like to get things done quickly. I don't know about you. And
when you get to my age,
if it's worth it,
you get to my age,
Supreme
you get
Court
to my age double, you'll feel it even stronger.
Terry, that's
There you go.
exactly the way by the founding fathers. That's what they said in Philadelphia. You know what? We don't have one checks and balances. We gotta get things done quickly, damn it. We want a system that gets things streamlined and as fast as possible. Exactly what the framers intended in 1787.
Two things can be true. You don't have to necessarily say that you're giving up the checks, and it's just the responsibilities moving much more directly to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, they have to now step up to the plate and not take months and months to issue a ruling. They have to be the ones to issue the injunction.
Just remember, they don't have to take any case if they don't want to.
And there you go. That's their prerogative, but that's part of the checks and balances.
So then how does it get, so here's the thing. When an injunction is issued, it is not a final order. It's an order to maintain the status quo until there is a final order. So I know that you're obviously an adherent to the concept of expediency over all. That's, I think, what you just expressed. But if it's the dismantling of the education department, that's one of the things the president wants to do. He wants to dismantle the education department, and perhaps, as the chief executive, he has the right to do so, or perhaps because the education department was authorized and funded by Congress, he does not. That's the issue at hand. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, and I'm not bad to the truth, that the latter is the appropriate decision, that he does not have the right to dismantle the education department. All right, so he just says, there's no good patent. I will note, it is not an auto patent, ladies and gentlemen. It is not an auto patent. So I just want to make that, I just want to make that very clear that unlike his predecessor, it is not an auto patent. Which, of course, if he signed with an auto patent, that would help with the expediency. But at any rate, he takes that Sharpie and he signs the executive order. And poof, the education department disappears. It no longer is in existence. Its assets are sold off. The programs that they were running come to an end. The various states that are accepting money from the federal government to help keep their education system going will lose that money. It takes the federal government out of the classroom and leaves it on the local level. All that, great. But now, here, the challenge to that, it's gone. There's no injunction to hold it. Now, the Supreme Court is not in session any longer, right? The Supreme Court right now is no longer in session for I don't know how many months it is before they're back in session. Somebody here will know more than me. Maybe Ben, I don't know. Doesn't matter. let's say 5 months before they're back in session, 4 months. The now status quo is there is no status quo, there is no education department. So now the case comes before the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court can do one of two things. They can say, let's hear this case to see whether the president had the right to disband the education department. Or the Supreme Court might rule, there is no education department, so plaintiff, you have no standing before the Supreme Court. One or the other. And in any event, it's a fait accompli. By the stroke of a pen, there no longer is an education department. All those people lost their jobs, which may be a good thing. You might argue that it's a good thing. All that funding to the local school districts and through their states comes to an end. All the programs that the education department oversaw, gone.
Can I add something here?
Even if the Supreme Court decides it is valuable to hear the case, even though they might say no standing, what difference does it make? There is no education department. It is gone. So, what is wrong, other than the fact that, you want things to be more rapidly decided? What is wrong with saying, wait, hold on. Let's not allow the disbanding of the education department until the Supreme Court has an opportunity, there's an opportunity to appeal this to the Court of Appeals, and then ultimately, as you have suggested, to the Supreme Court. No harm done, except people who, like Marissa Tomez in the movie Vinny, my cousin Vinny, everybody's biological clock is ticking. That's true. Our biological clocks are ticking. Now go ahead and my long question. I apologize.
I think another shifting of burden and responsibility that comes in is now going to be in the Congress, who are making the laws. So what happens? What just happened is some of the costs or some of this burden, some of these insurances that existed for apparatuses or processes that the government's been following have been removed, and now it's just like one person's whim, more or less. And you're giving examples of how
Congress is
this
already
is dangerous.
spoken. In the instant example that I just gave, Congress already spoke.
But that's what I'm getting at, Gary. I'm saying they didn't speak enough, and they didn't account for the fact that their work could just be undone like that. They didn't think about these sorts of contingencies. And now, in going forward, I think Congress is going to have to think about, let's put in some kind of insurances or poison pills or something, because if we're creating an education department, and we're damn sure we don't want it to be dismantled on a whim, because by default, there seems like that's a potential now. They're going to have to put in more clauses and so forth that, okay, maybe the president technically could undo this, but here's all these riders or whatever, all these contingency things that are in the law that the president will have to deal. I think that's how you would structure a deal if you're worried about contingencies. And these lawmakers, they're all lawyers. They know how to structure these things. They know how to write contracts, and they're going to have to think about these if conditions. If the president does X, then what? And then so they're going to. It's just a shifting of responsibilities. The people who are saying this is the end of democracy. How long have we been hearing that ever since?
I didn't, and that wasn't part of my argument.
You didn't, but I'm saying that phrase came up earlier from a few people, and it's just just yawn, yawn. Anyway, those are my thoughts. It's just a simple reshuffling of the deck of chairs, and life goes on. Thank you very much, Gary.
Well, here's another what if. What if the President of the United States tomorrow signs an executive order shutting down the FAA. It's too expensive. The FAA is too expensive.
You could do it, and I would imagine that then the Supreme Court would, if they care enough about the country, if they do it, they could just be like, no, we're on recess, we don't give a shit, and they'd be negligent in their duties, and like, whether or not they're in session or not, they have a duty now, they have a greater duty than they had before, to do something about it, to get back in session. It's totally their discretion whether they're working or not, and let's be real. So they could do that or not, and it's like, yeah, it's a messed up system if that's how it goes, and it's too bad that we put people in power or the system got so screwed up that that's the result. But people get the government they deserve.
So we'll just not fly planes in the United States.
So, yeah, it's like
well, I mean, a lot of things that have been established by Congress, like the FAA, which is established by statute and funded by Congress, could, if you could close down the education department with the stroke of a pen, you could close down the FAA, you'd be saving money, which is what they want to do, apparently.
Let's go.
So, okay, well, it'll be expedient. Steve.
Oh, me or the?
I apologize, Steve.
Okay. Well, there's a couple of things here I think we need to think about before we get too carried away with this line of thought. And one is this type of injunction, and I've done an AI search just to make sure that I had, because I knew this, I just didn't know the particulars of it. The AI search says this: for the first 175 years of the Republic, federal courts rarely, if ever, issued injunctions that apply beyond the parties in the state.
That's correct.
And common law. There's other instances here that cite that these kind of injunctions primarily start to kick off in the early to mid 60s. Coincidence? I don't think so. But we're not dealing with something here that has always been in place, that's always been a function, and I understood the operation of the judiciary. It's just not. So when people, say, oh my God, we're dealing away with these injunctions, well, guess what? These injunctions wasn't even really recognized as a function of the lower courts for a long time. And there's this thing with Hamilton that he writes about this, which should give us pause. We always talk about the overreach of the executive, but any of the branches, and I would argue that we've had overreaches by the judiciary. Hamilton wrote in his Federalist Papers, the judiciary is the weakest of the three branches of government, without purse or sword. The Supreme Court is dependent on the willingness of others to enforce its orders and on the public's belief in the impartiality to ensure compliance. So, this was the court system in and of itself was always envisioned, if we want to talk about our founders and our founding documents, because that's where this always seems to degenerate to, like we're just eviscerating the intent and will of our founding fathers. This is not true. The founding fathers always envisioned the courts and the Supreme Court as the least powerful of the three branches. And like I say, what we're arguing about here now is, I would say, where we started entering into an era that many people characterize as activist courts, where they overstepped the bounds of the judiciary. They wandered into areas that they has never intended constitutionally to be involved in. So to say that this is something new and oh my God, this is a function of Donald Trump's trying to influence the court. No, this is actually what the court functioned like for a long time, and it's what we've seen for the last 80 is more of an aberration, not an actual function of the lower courts. So if you think it's hysterical, if you think that the Republic is falling apart, well, I guess, well, before now, it fell apart for 175 years. So that to me kind of nips this argument kind of in the butt, along with the historical reasoning that our founders had and the value they placed in each branch of government, which inevitably led to the function of the citizen, that the government should be more. That's why the House of Representatives every 2 years, it's meant to be responsive to the citizenry. And that's why the House and the Senate should be more responsive to the needs and will of the people. So I think it's something that, and in your case, say the FAA was shut down, that you articulate. I think you could make a case for an emergency injunction to the emergency hearing by the Supreme Court. And I think in that case, I think the court would hear. I don't think there'd be any problem with it. So I think you can dig out these extreme cases and the functions they might have in society. But I think when it comes to something like the nationally functioning of the air traffic system in the country, or the big items that make our life manageable every day, I think we can get a fairly rapid response from the Supreme Court. So is it something different in the current environment where we see Republican and Democrats trying to get their guy to handcuff a president, but it's not historically the way it was, and I'll leave it there.
Of course, if we're going to look at history, Steve, historically, have any other presidents or how many other presidents before Donald Trump unilaterally abolished departments that were created and funded by Congress?
Well, and Gary, that's actually something I think should be adjudicated. And I think it should be adjudicated at the highest level, because by him doing that, a department that was put in place by the Congress, I think that becomes something that should be adjudicated to say, where does this power come? It's absolutely something that should be adjudicated. And as a general principle, I agree with you. The concentration of power in the presidency from the Democrats and the Republicans, it doesn't matter who's in the seat. Every president wants as much power as he can accumulate to be free of having to deal with this pesky Congress. So, but I think too that the Congress has advocated because of the split and to want to be reelected. They don't want to make the hard votes. They don't want to do the tough job. So I think there's a lot of blame to go around, but I think there's some things that have been raised through executive orders that the Supreme Court needs to adjudicate on Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3 powers and reestablish those lines, right, so everyone knows where they stand. I'll leave it there, Gary.
So I guess the ultimate argument is only the Supreme Court has the authority to throw a check, not the judiciary, specifically the Supreme Court, a check to what might be an illegal action by the presidency. Presidency, not president. Thank you, Steve. Yeah.
The word unfettered in the title of the room. I hope you will allow me to suggest that a synonym for that is unconstrained. So, did the Supremes give the presidency unconstrained power? No. No. No more, I mean, we're arguing semantics. was the nuclear weapons program of Iran obliterated with one military strike. And we've been arguing about that for 2 or 3 days, 4 days in this room. To say, and Jane and I know, well, she was back up on the stage, but I think she said,
I'm here.
some guy named Steve Aitken, who, okay, he's a lawyer and he was a clerk for Supreme Court Justice, but he just said, if I remember what you quoted, that the Supreme Court just did something with the rule of law. I think it was, it didn't say obliterated, but it canceled or it did something to suggest that we no longer have the rule of law. I think we're back into hyperbole.
There's a phrase, sorry to interrupt you, but they killed it.
Okay,
I agree with Steve Brown.
they killed the rule of law. Holy cow. Is anybody admit that is outright hyperbole? I mean, I don't want to get, I know we can't discuss this back and forth because of the constraints of the room, but to say that we have killed the rule of law by this Supreme Court decision, I think we're arguing hyperbole. Now, we have, Steve has articulated several times now the age-old, this goes back to the founding of the country. Steve quoted Jefferson, and he's quoted Hamilton. Jefferson was terrified. He was strongly against the power of the judiciary, the power of judges, as I recall Steve's comments. So, is it proper that one judge in one court can stop an action nationwide? I'm scratching my head on that because, and then I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but I don't think the president has unconstrained power. I think the constraints on his power have been adjusted by this ruling, but I don't think it's the end of the country, and I don't think we're killing the rule of law. And then this thing will wind its way through the courts, and I totally agree with the consensus in this room, I think, that Congress hasn't been that the executive over the last, well, let's just go through from 9/11, we can go back historically, but absolutely the executive keeps trying to accumulate more power within the executive branch. I don't think there's anybody that can argue that. But can you also argue that Congress continues to abdicate power to the executive because of its failure to act with the powers embedded in Article 1? So who's to blame? The executive trying to get more power, or Congress as a body abdicating that power? And in the midst of that tangle, we now have single judges that are going to try to arbitrate, or should those kinds of arguments or questions go to the ultimate power and to declare something unconstitutional, which always has been in the hands of the Supreme Court? So this is an interesting argument. I believe that we are not we're not going to shut down the FAA and have airplanes grounded. And Trump has said he wants to shut down the Department of Education. He said that on his campaign, and he's going to try to do it, but he's got to. It sounds to me like he says it's going to take an act of Congress to do it. So we'll have to wait and see whether the whole department gets shut down or not. But I think
saying the semantics. These are not actually nationwide decisions. These are temporary injunctions. So all it's doing is putting things on hold until there is a nationwide decision. So if expediency is important over following the process, then I'm with you and with Dublin. But if we want to be more deliberate about how we approach these issues, and we wanted to give it a chance, as you point out, to wind its way through the courts, these various issues, eventually to the Supreme Court. I mean, there are 600 district court judges in this country, more or less. That's a lot more opportunity for judicial review than just the members of one court, you know. So I think part of the reason we have this process is to unburden the Supreme Court from having to hear every single case. It's, you know, we're going to be putting a lot on the Supreme Court here if we say we're not going to have lower court decisions that can hold until it gets to the Supreme Court.
Very, very quick, just since Nancy mentioned me. I think that if you don't want to listen, Nancy, to me, or my reference to Steve Brown, my friend Al Stern, who I think you know, reminds me that Justice Brown Jackson said, with deep disillusionment, I dissent. So you could read what the dissenting actual constitutional scholars who are in the Supreme Court.
Right, but the majority are also actual constitutional scholars, and they disagree with that position, so.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
But I didn't want, I thought just maybe an alternative that's less disputable than me is.
I'm more than happy to have that discussion with you, Kate. We just can't do it in this room. The room's not designed for that kind of dialogue.
Fair enough.
So, so I'm not diminishing what you have to say. I was just trying to make sure I got the point right. And I strongly disagree with the words uttered by Mr. Acorn that the Supreme Court just killed the rule of law. I think that's a gross exaggeration of what happened. But you can disagree, and I'd love to go one-on-one with you sometime over a cup of coffee.
Thank you, Anson and Jane. We are into extra time. No additional people will be invited onto the stage, but we're going to try our darndest to get to everyone, except here's the aforementioned Steve Pearl. I have to give him the opportunity to respond to those who reference him. So hang on for that, folks. All right, so let's move along rapidly. Dominic.
Okay, Gary, I'll be quick. Let's see here. They use constitutional law to effect social change. Is an American, it's American, right? I think in terms of significant constitutional cases, Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. You spoke about the Mark, 1898. That's birthright citizenship case. In each of those cases, it's interesting enough, one justice dissented in both. Justice Harlan is made famous by his dissent in the Supreme Court's decision denying citizenship to black citizens, not blacks in the United States. And his dissent in that case was heralded as an act of bravery and constitutional ethics. And his dissent in the Kitover case, which established birthright citizenship, is often discarded as racist and antiquated.
Didn't an amendment to the Constitution establish birthright citizenship?
Well, in the King Martin DeSantis could not deny public education to the children of illegal immigrants. That case, which probably ranks as probably the most important immigration-related civil rights cases in American history, which was decided by a 6-2 decision with Justice Rehnquist and Justice Berger dissenting. The two of them held that the United States could not prevent a state from deciding how it was going to spend its money. And that case is held up. Of course, it did a tremendous amount to stimulate mass migration in the United States. Since we don't know what happened since 1982 with mass migration. But the idea that you could get a free education for your children was an incredible stimulus to the idea of migration in the hemisphere. But that case, interestingly enough, was brought by the U.S. Congress of Catholic bishops who hired I guess you might call him a famous migration advocate, lawyer, guy by the name of Paul, who had attended a conference in Latin America. I used to know this connection, but they issued like sort of an encyclical, sort of a Catholic oriented document that challenged the United States to become, that challenged Catholics, that challenged the Supreme Court of the United States to take action in the area of education and civil rights as it relates to illegal immigrants. I thought that was a fascinating exercise in civil liberties, if you want to call it that, advocacy, crushing the separation of church and state, and so I just kind of wanted to take the gloss of some kind of idealistic notion that a constitutional law is some kind of kindergarten where only nice people play. And that hardball politics need not enter. And I think Anson's notation with the use about the use of hyperbole is an interesting case, an interesting take on it. So that's all I really have. I just wanted to mention that.
I just want to publicly thank Nancy for correcting me. Of course, her last name is totally not 2 minutes. I think I said 2 minutes. I apologize for that. Thank you, Dominic. We now go to Steve Appel.
Hi, Gary. Hi, Scott. Hello, everybody else. Gary, if it's okay with you, I would like to donate all of my time, except for 60 seconds, to Steve Crone.
Yeah, we're definitely going to get to Steve, so don't worry. I've carved out time for him. Don't worry.
Okay, well, I would just like to reserve 60 seconds to, after he speaks, ask him a follow-up question or two, but I would like to...
Stand the stage, and after Steve's turn, we'll give Steve an opportunity to question Steve, and then we will allow Steve to respond to Steve's questioning. Steve.
Thank you.
You're welcome. David. David.
Sorry, Barry, but maybe only looking at my phone. I think everything's been said there with regard to what this represents for the nation, what this represents for the Trump administration executive power. Supreme Court obviously was a predictable ruling, and the number 6-3 is obviously in line with some other very important decisions down the pike. Recall these are the same justices who swore an oath that precedent, that abortion precedent was the rule of law when they got their nominations, when they made the short list of right-wing Catholic in this country, and we've seen the assault on a lot of these liberties. A lives of countless millions of Americans going to be inoculant says volumes with regard to the police powers.
We lost you there, David. Sorry. Yeah.
The ball strikes, Gary.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on here. I don't hear David at all.
Yeah, me neither. I think he's in the Matrix. Thank you, Gary. I think lots of us have. Hello?
You're there, Ben.
Okay. David, feedback. Looking at this opinion, I think it's far-reaching in a couple ways. First of all, it decides universal injunctions availability as a relief offered by the federal court. And I think that's quite significant beyond the birthright citizenship issue. This is really an opinion that takes away a major tool that could not be used by federal courts to rein in unconstitutional legal actions of the executive branch. In some ways, it dovetails pretty nicely with quotation marks, with the provision in the Big Beautiful providing limiting authority of the federal court for relief on contempt of court order, meaning in a case such as discussed previously, the immigration cases, if the federal government decides to ignore Judge Boasberg or any other judge order on the action of the executive branch, there's there's a lot less that the court can actually enforce its orders. So I think this is a sort of a continuous piece in the chess game, if you will, of basically enabling the executive branch and basically amplifying its power. I specifically did not mention Trump administration because this is about judicial branch, executive branch, and legislative branch.
Exactly.
Yeah, in a few years' time, I know fortune teller, but there's a non-zero possibility that the presidency can be held by Democrats. It's not like, well, it's probably difficult in this current political environment, but it's not possible. And as we saw what happened in New York City mayor's race, politics have to really respect laws of physics. With action, there's counteraction. When the political pendulum swings to the far right, there's a counterforce that makes it go to the far left. So I think the opinion is very significant. It's long-reaching. It's a bit of ironic that when you're reading the majority's opinion, a major authority, if you will, or logic that it relies on is to go back to the Quran, to the provided in that 1789 Judicial Act, and this majority in this opinion says we should look at that time in England. Obviously, the Court of Equity is enclosed in the 1789 Act, so federal courts in the U.S. should have equitable power. But the majority describes that equitable power as, let's look at the type of equitable power that in 17-something English courts that they have, and we should really limit or restrain the federal court, the equitable power to those type of circumstances. That's, to me, that's very jarring. Because it basically ignores really the definition of equitable power. But having said that, I'll say a few things, but I found this kind of interesting that I mentioned in this room because, we're not a court of law, this is not a law school, even though probably Student Pro will give us an excellent description of the cases. I'll mention a couple of things that I thought would be entertaining from a reader's perspective. When the majority described Justice Jackson's dissent, the tone seems to be very dismissive, and it reads more like sort of a law article or even the journalist's description or advocacy piece versus a balanced decision promoting in their colleagues.
For example, from what I hear from those who were in the court reporting on television today, it was a very interesting. You could hear a pin drop in the court, which you should anyway in the Supreme Court. But there was a lot. I mean, she was sitting right next to Kobe Barrett apparently because Gorsuch wasn't there, and it was a very tense kind of a situation.
So there's one point where Justice Barrett, the majority, attacks Jackson's dissent's rationale to the fact that she's the majority of that is alleging, in the name of restraining executive power, Justice Jackson is advocating for the supremacy of the courts, meaning that to prevent the key-like power exercised by the executive branch, maybe Jackson was advocating that the executive branch, the judges should be advocating. I'm paraphrasing, this is not correct. But what I found that's very interesting and very important to speak to that is, majority says the Congress has constrained in the Judicial Act. What matters now is how judiciary can constrain the executive. Justice Jackson would do well to keep her own admonition. Everyone from the president on down is bound by law. She's quoting Justice Jackson. But then the majority goes on to say, that goes for the judges. Now, I just want to address that conclusion for a second. That seems to be saying, hey, judges, you're not better than the executive branch. That's not very rational reason, right? Co-equal branch, right? However, in the matter of constitutional interpretation, someone has to have the final word. Someone, in the case, one of the three branches, right? Otherwise, it would be he said, she said, or in the case of three parties, it said, some other parties said. So, in the case of a federal court, the courts are very, they do have limited jurisdiction, absolutely. But the limited jurisdiction does not mean that courts are always so inferior to what's so-called elected officials. In some cases, particularly with respect to constitutional interpretation, the courts, I find that, again, at least this is the theory that I believe makes more sense. And that is because the legislature and the executive branch, they basically have power in many other areas of the law of our lives. They can decide on taxation rates. They can decide on interstate commerce, blah blah, etc. That sort of thing. They can decide on national language. were startled or annoyed at Disney Sense announcement that no one is above the law, and by retorting to say, well, of course they're not above the law either, I think that's a bit of a disingenuous, because in the case that these Justice 9 people are facing, they have to have the final say, and in reality, it is the final say. After the universal injunction is denied, that's pretty much the last resort, unless Congress comes up with certain new statutory provisions giving the universal injunction to the courts. And even then, as some of the concurrence have said in the decision, that may not be constitutional permissible, even if Congress were to give federal court universal injunction power. And I also know that pretty much everybody, not everybody, but 4 or 5, Justice Thomas, Kavanaugh, they all wrote separately. Beyond saying, oh, I agree with majority, no universal injunction, Justice Alito even said something, hey, this is the max. Plaintiffs don't think too hard. We're not going to give you a lot of things more than what you're entitled to or what you think you're entitled to. So it seems like the majority is some of the justices on the majority. They don't even think that the majority opinion is enough. They want to announce more stricter rules, and even sort of, in my mind, further weakening of the judicial power. So I will end this by saying this. Yes, if you happen to be on the political spectrum of the Trump, etc., you'll be very, very happy because your president has less restraint on the type of executive order that they can do, the administration can do. But remember, be careful of what you wish for. And this is the same thing when in the judicial nomination, the fight in terms of the nomination and the judicial process in the Senate. One party may think we're going to screw the other party by changing the rules, but then again, it comes back and haunt you. And I think the problem for us, the voters, in general, the Joe Schmoes, if you will, is that this trend further divides this country up. And honestly, in my mind, it weakens the democracy. It may not take a democracy away, but it weakens the American democracy to the point almost like what James was suggesting, maybe even jokingly, that maybe there should be 2 countries, the Confederate, the former Confederate states, and then the rest of the whatever those states you want to call it. That is obviously laughable and not likely, but it really points to the possibility that the United States of America as a whole country is weakened by some of the decisions that we're facing today, and that is not a good thing for anyone. So I just hope that this opinion, this decision alerts all the voters that when we thought that the courts can check the power of the executive branch, the check and balance, perhaps that's idealistic thinking on our part. Maybe we should recognize that the federal courts are not to be relied upon for protecting minority right, minority, I don't mean racial, I mean the percentage-wise in terms of offered by the Constitution. Maybe we're back in the Darwinism era where really majority wins, which after all is some people think what democracy is. Thank you, Derek.
So you mentioned the pension. Just remember when the pension swings from one side to the other, it has to go through them. David, you want to try again?
Yeah, Gary, can you hear me?
For now.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. I was, what I wanted to say, what I was trying to say was that it's no accident, I don't think, that, again, the pattern of this court, Supreme Court, their 6-3 decision, considering dissents that came from Jackson, Sotomayor, really speak to the climate and the environment we find ourselves here in these United States of America. And I'm speaking to the assault on immigration, assault on immigrants from all stripes, not just the Latino community, the Asian community, the Hindu, Muslim communities all over America that find themselves shuddering in their houses while the ICE men of this country allegedly in the process of eradicating our criminals. So the fact that this lower court judge ought to be applauded for reading the Constitution the way it enables truth. And Gary, this didn't happen overnight. The law being in place now, based on our Constitution being at a heavy cost against many in this country, the history of this country, where equal rights was for. Dred Scott was just emblematic of thousands and thousands of slaves and descendants of slaves who were denied their rights. The Kim decision is another a recent example of not allowing a Chinese American or Chinese national from owning his birthright in this country. So the fact now that we see many descendants of Latino communities, the children of these undocumented, being potentially denied the rights, their birthright to this nation is nothing more than overreach, which you call by many stripes, and I'm not going to go there. But they could have said this is the law of the land. They could have denied Trump with victory, and could have maybe said that the injunction, while broad and sweeping in its power, even if it marks with regard to how the Constitution is written. And how we're structured to address these grievances. But our nation is just full of examples of where, Dominic pointed out the mighty word decision in Texas that said we have to educate the undocumented. So this nation has to somehow come to grips with the changing demographics and not use the power of the state to try to remedy or equal the playing field or whatever it is they're trying to do, Gary. I'm all for a safe nation. I'm all for a nation governed by laws and not men. I'm all for a nation that includes as many people as possible within the law of that. And I get it. There are a lot of people in this country that are working Americans, got there somehow, some way, illegally, didn't follow the rules. Well, let's create better rules. Let's create a better streamlined process to put these people to work, to educate them, to have them here legally, and illegally have this climate of fear. And I appreciate you, Gary, alluding to the fact, I'll land here because I want to hear what Steve has to say. I appreciate Gary using your cultural heritage and your background to frame this in a way that speaks to a very horrific time in our world's history. Now as the whole, I thought, because I can't speak that way like you can, Gary. I didn't have family that died over there in that respect. Or I am not part of the community that faces anti-Semitism on a daily basis. So, but I will say this, it is representative. When I see what's happening here in Los Angeles, this is just nothing more than another strike of mark against the hard-working communities in this country. And I'll end there.
Thank you, David. I might have misunderstood something that you said, so whether I did or didn't misunderstand you, I will point out that the justices did not weigh in on the question at the heart of that lawsuit. In other words, whether birthright citizenship order itself is constitutional. That has not yet been.
Yeah, you're right.
Okay, thank you, David. We'll go now to Hermes.
Good evening, Gary. Yeah, it's a sad day in our country. I don't want to say much because I don't want to repeat what people have said, so I would say that I hope we can make things better. Thanks for the mic, Gary.
Thank you, Hermes. And before we go to Steve Cohen, I just want to point out what I said at the beginning, and that is the reason the title says presidency and not president is because it has effect on ensuing administrations, which may not be philosophically aligned with the current one, and that's something that you all needs to be considered. Steve Cohen.
I haven't been here since the beginning of the room, so I just chanced into the room just as my name was being mentioned. It was really surreal. So I have actually 5 points I want to make. One of them is not about, if I understood this right, were people really debating the headline of my Clubhouse obviously the answer to that question is no. You didn't really believe that was up for debate. You just wrote a headline that would kind of frame what you were going to talk about today, and you weren't actually trying to summarize some opinion about what happened today. I assume most people understand that. We had a 2-hour discussion today about this opinion. And to the extent that people are excited that the headline didn't encapsulate what happened, oh, mea culpa, please forgive me. I mean, that's just so stupid that I don't think.
I am so, this is like a support, you should come along.
I mean, that's just so.
Because I get this all the time, that people come to the stage, and I guess you get it as well. I don't know what goes on in other rooms of Clubhouse, because I'm not a Clubhouse user, you know, right? But I have had people come on, and rather than discuss the topic based on the intent, I mean, you only have a finite number of characters, right? You know, they'll take issue with how I framed it. Well, that's just clickbait, Gary, or, you know, unfettered. Yes, that exactly has, and will probably continue. And I'm so glad you mentioned that. I feel so much better. I feel
You're still awful, Gary. I mean, that's
well, that may be true, but at least in terms of that aspect of what I'm doing, I'm glad to see that you're getting the same things that I'm.
so. Well, I didn't know I was until I happened in here. So, and now 5 quick substantive points. First is, it's a false dichotomy to suggest that the choice we have is between willy-nilly, unreviewable nationwide injunctions that can't be reviewed by anyone and are, you know, and no power for any federal court to ever issue a nationwide injunction. Those are not the only 2 choices. Before this opinion was issued today, there were guidelines about when courts could and couldn't do this. They've always been reviewable. A court of appeals can sometimes act within a few days or a week if some rogue district judge issues an unconscionable nationwide injunction. It's just a false dichotomy. It's just lazy intellectually. That's not the choice. But what the court did today is pick one of those 2 choices. And even that isn't correct, because they actually didn't rule on nationwide injunctions either. Everyone has gotten the point that they didn't rule on birthright citizenship. But they also didn't rule on nationwide injunctions as a technical matter, because all they were doing was reviewing a request to stay an injunction of a lower court, which is itself a form of preliminary relief, which means they just said it was likely not within the power of federal courts. Or stated another way, the government was likely to win on the merits when this is actually litigated on the merits.
Oh man, I'm so glad you pointed that out. I did not even focus on that in the last hour and a half, the term likely, and you were absolutely correct.
So, but again, it has the effect of essentially sending the message that that's going to be the law of the land, even if it isn't. So, point 1, false dichotomy. You can have nationwide injunctions with review, with guidelines. Sometimes they make sense, and sometimes they don't.
But Steve, let me interrupt you for a second to say that at 11:30 this morning, I actually yelled about 11:39, so like 40 minutes or something after the decision was handed down, the president held a mini news conference where he basically said that is exactly what has happened.
Right, well, he's an ignoramus, but, you know, let's not get sidetracked on what he thinks about this. Point number 2, the court's logic actually dictates that all federal courts, including the Supreme Court, probably don't have the power to issue nationwide injunctions. So to the extent that people are saying, oh, it's just district courts that shouldn't be doing this, out in the dissent. And Justice Barrett, in the majority opinion, does not claim that this is an inaccurate claim. She actually says, of course the executive is supposed to follow the law. Of course, if the courts tell the executive that something they want to do or have done is unconstitutional, they're supposed to listen to the court. But that doesn't mean that the court has the power to force them to. So the idea that this is just something about lower federal judges also just doesn't have any connection to what's actually happening. Point 3. Yes, this is a very serious problem. Again, mea culpa, it's the death of the rule of law. You got me, I'm an ignoramus. But it's a very serious problem that's going to arise in certain cases. It's not going to arise in every case because many cases don't require a nationwide injunction to provide adequate relief. But in some cases, this is going to be a real problem. What the court, in effect, is saying today is that in a wide variety of settings, if the executive branch violates someone's constitutional rights or someone's statutory rights, and they sue and they win, it might be an individual, it might be a group of individuals, it might even be a class of 6,000 individuals. Federal courts probably only have the power to issue relief with regard to that one person or 6 people or 6,000 or whatever it is. And sometimes that just doesn't make any sense. A situation where the president announces that nobody has birthright citizenship anymore and starts to take rights away from people. And then 3 federal judges, not 1, 3 federal judges, 3 federal judges all find this to be perhaps the easiest case that's ever come before them because it's so obviously unconstitutional. What the Supreme Court said today is that the executive should be free to continue to take away the rights from everyone else who wasn't a party to one of those 3 lawsuits. And then those people can go to court and get another federal judge to say it's obviously unconstitutional. But even after that happens, the executive can keep doing it to lots and lots of other people. And in contexts where a president like the one we currently have might be very cavalier about violating people's constitutional and statutory rights, that's a very serious problem. Oh, it's illegal to arrest people in the way you have and fly them off to a foreign country. Let's assume a court held that. And then the president just did it again to another group of people. Well, the court's position is, well, yeah, that's okay. The court can't say, don't do that anymore. They can only say, you violated the rights of the people who are suing you because you did it to them. But those other people that you did it to the next day, after we told you it was unconstitutional, we can't tell you not to do it to them. We expect you to follow the law, but we have no power to force you to follow the law. As was said in a very different context, in fact, almost the opposite context, frankly, the Constitution is not a suicide pact. The idea that we need to interpret, I'll say, the Judiciary Act of 1789 is not a suicide pact. The idea that the court just had no choice but to interpret the Judiciary Act in a way that prevents a court from saying to a president, you're doing something that's unconstitutional. We're ordering you not to do it to anybody else, not just the people who are suing you today. They didn't have to do that. That's point 3. Point 4, the court ignores the underlying facts. And for one reason, that's totally appropriate, obviously. The court wasn't addressing the question of whether an executive order eliminating constitutional birthright citizenship
doesn't mean that those underlying facts are not relevant to this case. The court would have been faced with any kind of facts. The underlying lawsuit might have been about anything, but it was about something. It was about stripping folks of rights that they have by virtue of the fact that they're U.S. citizens. The right to be here, the right to receive certain kinds of benefits, all sorts of rights that flow from citizenship. And indeed, one of the parties suing was a group of states who were saying this is a problem because of the way we allocate certain benefits, and citizenship is a part of how that's done. That's what this case was about. So the court didn't simply make some technical ruling about the Judiciary Act and nationwide injunctions. They said to this president, with regard to these litigants, you can't treat them as if they don't have citizenship. Maybe it has to be sent back to the court to limit the injunction just to them. But as to anybody else, go ahead and keep doing it. Don't worry about it, because a court can't tell you to stop doing it. The court can decide a case cognizant of those facts. It wasn't deciding that issue, but this isn't in a vacuum. We're not talking about just any president and any case. We're talking about a president who has shown not just a predilection, but a relish for taking away people's rights. And my final point is a minor one, but it's just in response to something you said. It's often said when the court does something that folks believe is, expanding presidential power too much, or giving Congress too much power, or curtailing Congress's power too much, or anything involving the three branches of government. Oh, well, you may like it now because it's your president or you like the Congress's policies, but it could swing the other way. This to me is one of the most specious things. Obviously, it's literally true, but it implicitly assumes that every president is predisposed to act in the way that this administration acts. And that's ridiculous. There's no reason to believe that virtually any other person, if any other person, who's ever been elected to the office of president would behave anything like this person behaves. And are there isolated examples of presidents doing things that are unconstitutional, ignoring court orders? Of course, there are isolated incidents. But the breadth and scope of the lawlessness of this administration is absolutely unprecedented. And in the face of that, the Supreme Court says, we expect the executive to follow the law, but we can't make it.
You'll go away, Steve, because Steve Appel has a question for you.
Thank you very much. Number one, Steve Crone, I was your room today. If replays were on, I heard they were. If you could send me a link to the room, because I checked on your profile, I don't see it. I greatly appreciate it.
Just go to SCOTUS Confidential or Supreme Court Confidential, and you'll find it.
Thank you. I'd like to ask one follow-up question, and I'll be done. Thank you. Steve, just to clarify, the ruling today, does it or does it not apply to all the presidents of the United States going forward?
It does not. But there's a technical reason which I tried to explain. The court did not rule today that under the Judiciary Act of 1789, federal judges do not have the power to issue nationwide injunctions. They did not rule that. What they ruled on was a motion by the government to stay an injunction ordered by a lower court. So what the Supreme Court did is they said, we agree with you, government.
We are telling the lower courts that issued these injunctions that they need to reconsider what they did in light of our opinion and narrow their injunctions. That's all they did. This case only applies to the litigants in the 3 cases that were on appeal today in the Supreme Court. So that's the technical answer to your question. However, the court also wrote, I don't know how many, 30, 40 pages, on why they believe that the Judiciary Act doesn't authorize federal courts to issue nationwide injunctions. So if I were a litigant in a case, it doesn't have to be the president, in which a federal court issued a nationwide injunction, I would certainly go into court tomorrow and I would say, hey judge, you want to reconsider what you did to my client in light of that beautiful Supreme Court opinion yesterday? And some judges might say, okay, I'll reconsider, but a judge would be perfectly within their rights, in my opinion, to say, what are you talking about? They opined about what they thought would likely happen when that issue is litigated. They lifted a stay in a particular case. That's got nothing to do with you or this case. And get out of my courtroom. There's still a nationwide injunction. Pound sand.
Thank you, Steve.
And thank you, both Steves. Folks, we're here Monday through Friday from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. New York time. So until 5 p.m. New York time on Monday, everybody stay safe, be well, have a great weekend, and peace out.
The argument was that an average woman is equivalent to a high value man. And I really been trying to think about that because I really feel like that is true. I feel like even the Avi was talking about like the totality of things. Like if we see one trait in a woman, we say she's masculine. If we see one trait in a man, we say she's feminine. I don't necessarily agree. But yes, if she has one trait that's not deemed feminine, she's deemed as masculine. But I feel like men get a lot of grace with their femininity because a lot of them are not operating in masculinity. You know, we live in a culture where it is okay for men to omit their masculine responsibilities. We deem co-parenting okay, like that's a new thing. It's like co-parenting, but you know, being on the front line every day with your child, or you know, living or leading patriarch-led households, that's not, you know, that's the ultimate idea of masculinity. Like a father being present in the home being led by patriarchy, because they say you are what your father is, and that's why we take our father's last name and whatnot. But we have tons of households, especially in the Black community, that are not led that way. Kids have their mother's last names. You know, kids either have their mother's last names, or the husband or the man not being there and being okay with having multiple broken homes and whatnot. So a lot of men get leeway when it comes to this whole masculinity thing, and it really gets reduced to like an aesthetic. So if a man is tall, they say that men who aren't tall is not masculine. That's bullshit. Like, I mean, just because he's not tall, does that mean he's not masculine? You know what I mean? But he might be a damn good father, like, but he's not tall. He doesn't, quote unquote, let his nuts hang or whatever, so he's not masculine. Like, so there's a lot of promotion of toxic masculinity, and you know, men they get away with it. They get away with doing a lot of feminine things, and you know, still being able to, like for instance, they always say women are emotional. Men are more emotional than women. They just try to show it. They just try to hide it with stoicism. Like they try to be stoic, but it's like, no, you're emotional as hell. Like you can't really control your emotions. Like you make decisions out of emotions. You decide that you're not gonna take care of this child because you wasn't in love with the woman, but you're gonna take care of the child that you married the woman. So that's the build up the emotion. You decided to whether you want to be a father or not based on how you feel about a woman. That's emotional. So you know, at the end of the day, you know, I feel like for me, that's why I feel like money, it's not in totality. It's not like only money-based masculinity. But the thing about money, the thing about having wealth is that what it shows is a level of discipline that a lot of people don't have, especially, black men, because it takes time, skill, investment, focus to be able to master something to where you're making good money. Not just have money. When you're making good money, whether you're an athlete, an entrepreneur, whether you go to school, whether this, whatever, the things that these women are doing, the things that these women are doing, they need to do it as well.
Hey, can I ask you a question?
Wait, could I respond? I was just trying to respond.
I want to ask you one simple question real quick. And we can move on. Do you find Barack Obama, would you say that he's masculine? Do you find him as a masculine man? And that's the question, yes or no?
Absolutely, yes.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah, okay, so Penny, I just wanted to respond because of what you were saying in the disagreement. So, this is why I don't like it when people describe masculinity and femininity as opposites. Because what that often leads people to believe is that if you're not one, you must be the other. So, for example, like, when we're talking about it, like you just said, like, some men get away with not being very masculine. Sure, and I would agree with that. Plenty of men get away with not being masculine. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're being feminine, though. And here's an example. For example, like if a guy, he's supposed to be like a hard worker, go-getter, all that kind of stuff. Okay, but he's actually not any of that. He's lazy. Does that mean he's feminine? No, because laziness is not femininity, right? That's not necessarily femininity. It's just a bad trait. It's not a feminine trait. You get what I'm saying? Like, just because you don't perform as masculine very well, like you're not doing the masculine things you want, or you are not being masculine or whatever, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that you're being feminine. It just might mean you're just not a good person. You're just lazy, you're annoying, you're uncontrolling your emotions. Like, that's another example you talk about men being emotional, right? Like, I don't even like it when people associate being emotional like as a feminine trait, because it's not really a desirable trait. I've never heard, no man, never seen nor heard any man go, man, I'm really attracted and I'm really turned on by women who cry all the time and bickering and doing all this and all that, right? Like being uncontrolled in their emotions. I don't think that's an attractive feature at all, period, in men or women. And so, like, sometimes because we're associating masculinity and femininity as opposites, we just look at anytime somebody fails at doing.
Please, $300 tonight. If you just
really? And under that 300, I want my motherfucking 100, and I'm gonna give April the 5. So I'll give her the 5, and I'll give the man 5, and you can take the 200. Now, 50K says,